Hello, sir.
Yes.
It's an honor to have you on. I just want to ask you a couple of questions. First question is, what were the benefits of growing up in the Jim Crow South?
First, it helped us to know who we were because we were not distracted by attempting to assimilate in a community of white dominance where the wealth and politics were controlled outside of our own race. And by having been forcefully segregated, we had to create our own resources, modest though they were, our own schools where our teachers had a great deal of interest and concern for us and knew us and would visit our homes if we were not doing well, where we had our own businesses such as the People's Drugstore with Dr. Pippin at the corner of Mississippi and Walker and Dr. Irvin down at Lauderdale and Vance, and we had the Universal Life Insurance Company and Dr. James W. Hose over in Mississippi Boulevard, and we also had black lawyers who came up with a sense of dedication to fight for the community, to stand up in the courts, to fight against racial segregation in the laws, to represent those who were arrested for challenging segregation. So we had a professional black community that had a sense of dedication because we all felt a part of the broader unified struggle of African Americans for change, to challenge segregation, which held us all back. And I think it's that sense of cohesion and that sense of power that we had once unified to work together. We learned the resourcefulness that we have within ourselves, and we saw ourselves build from little to great achievements within our communities, on to college as first-generation college students, such as myself, to begin our advance in higher education. So there were many great benefits that arose out of the adversity and the mischievousness and injustice of racial segregation.
What were some of the disadvantages then?
Disadvantages were that as we were being segregated and discriminated against as a people, the great wealth of this country and of one community after the other was being accumulated and monopolized during our entire history, going from slavery in 1619 through the Civil War and racial discrimination that followed the Civil War. We were not given opportunities to have equal jobs irrespective of our talents. We were not given economic support as whites were. You take, for example, even in the 1930s, when a number of programs were funded by the national government to rebuild the country from the economic doldrums of the Great Depression under President Roosevelt, that many of the programs that were funded by the federal government did not proportionately benefit blacks. They were put in the South in the control of white officials. The farm subsidy programs, even the home loan programs under the GI Bill were not afforded to blacks in the same way that they were whites. And so we suffered enormously and were weakened enormously by the lack of economic infusion of capital and fairness to help our communities build, so that by the time in the 1960s, following the push from the Supreme Court in 1954, which outlawed segregation, and then by 1965, when Congress had passed the Fair Employment Act, or Title VII, to ban racial discrimination in employment, by the time those things were in place, all of the wealth and ownership of most of the property and capital of this capitalist country was already in other people's hands. And so we have been severely handicapped by being put in the race at this late stage when so many eons of progress and change have gone to the other side in terms of the economics and capital of America.
Yeah, I thought your book did an excellent job of portraying the socio-economic factors in regards to Jim Crow practices, not only in the South but also in America, because I thought that when I was reading your book that you not only had fantastic role models within your family, you had so many role models to pull from that close-knit community. But also I think about the fact when I think of a role model, it's not necessarily a person that you might want to emulate. It's a person that presents to you an alternative or another option in life. They don't have to be necessarily a good or bad person, but they represent another avenue or outlet to go through. And I just think that, what do you think is the problem with black communities today? Because when I talk to older people, I talk to people like Charles Evans, when I talk to other folks, they always talk about how really the ending of segregation really hurted the black community.
Well, today I think that our problem first started with our young people is that they are disconnected from their past. They do not understand that these stories, such as I tell in my book of the struggle for civil rights among students, that led to the civil rights revolution of the 60s, when not only black students, but we inspired white students to organize and rise up, who joined us in fighting against segregation, white northern students particularly, and who then went on to fight against the injustice of the Vietnam War. Today's young people often look back at the struggles that we had, and people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks at the Montgomery bus boycott, and they think that this is some distant history, disconnected from them, and it's something that it's rather quaintly interesting to listen to, but they don't connect with it. And that's because their minds have been diverted from a real understanding of the continuity of oppression that afflicts them as much as it did us. And that's why I was talking about the economic issues that are just as severe, if not more so now, affecting our people. And we used to have a slogan in the civil rights movement run that said a voteless people is a hopeless people. That thought was that if we could get blacks to register and vote and get blacks into public office, that we would be able to make some change. And that was the feeling of black officials at that time. When blacks ran for public office in the 1950s and the 1960s, and when blacks struggled for the right to vote, it was to put people in office, not just blacks, but whites as well, who were committed to change and committed to racial fairness. But today, many of our black officials across this country are committed to advancing their own futures and their own self-interest, and committed to getting in on the exploitation of the have-nots who still are locked out. And by that I mean that they get into positions of power, whether it's on the state level or whether it's on the city council level or the county commission level, and they become so anxious to become partners with the very whites who suppressed and excluded us from the beginning, the corporations. And blacks have become beholden to these corporations. The black political leadership has its hand out, and even if it doesn't have its hand out, for the few crumbs that they get often for supporting and lending their blanket endorsement to the agenda of the corporate communities in city after city, across this state and across this country, even if there's no money involved, they have a psychological compulsion to be a part of the master's grand plan for him to stay in power. And so our political leaders are weak and ineffective for the most part. Our youth are not politically conscious to understand the dynamics of oppression and the responsibility that they have today to stand up and fight. And unfortunately for young people, they do not have the inspiration in the colleges and among the religious community often that in the 60s and the 50s we had, that inspired and encouraged us to have the courage to stand up. They don't have strong black leaders who are uncompromising and who, like Malcolm X, for example. I brought Malcolm X, and I talk about that in the book, The Education of a Black Radical, to speak on our college campus in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1963 when he was living in New York. And he came to my campus to speak at my invitation. And he didn't charge me a quarter of speaker fee to come there and talk to us young people and to challenge us to make a change. The only thing that I paid Malcolm for his visit was $75 to cover the gas cost to come from New York to Worcester, Massachusetts. We had leaders like that whose main goal, Ron, was to inspire, was to be a part of a movement